one of the recipients of the prestigious Asia Pacific Autism Award in 2013. An impressive career in autism spanning over 30 years, including experiences as a speech pathologist, principal, senior manager, and an academic, and teacher in both mainstream and special education. With several publications to her name, her current work includes enhancing the understanding of subtypes of autism, the experience of the intervention that the children receive, and the impact of school support on developmental and behavioral trajectories. Ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Professor Jacqueline Roberts to talk about autism and education, current practices, issues, and emerging trends.
Thank you, and thank you for the welcome and the fantastic care and hospitality that we've had since we've been here in Kerala. It's been an extraordinary experience so far and delightful to be here. I'm from Griffith University in Australia, and as mentioned, we do have a graduate studies program online in autism studies, and also we do a lot of research focusing particularly on learning and all aspects of learning across the age range and the spectrum of autism. I won't go into detail because I've been told not to, and I can see the clock ticking away up there. But if anybody has any questions or any things they'd like to know about the centre at Griffith, please come and find me or send something on the app. Now, I want to move on, but the slide doesn't. Let's see if it goes backwards. Yes, it goes backwards. It's not going forwards. Here we are. Good. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is to look at the whole issue of autism and education. It's been very interesting so far to hear speakers speaking about personal experiences with autism, particularly Bill's experience with the education system, because he navigated through the mainstream, and also to hear Mary talking about the situation here in India, which I think is quite similar elsewhere in the world in terms of where children with autism are educated and what the issues are. Certainly the numbers here are obviously very high, and I think for all of us internationally, the focus really is on, as well as setting up specialist services for children with autism, it's got to be on what we can do in mainstream education to make things better, to improve outcomes for students with autism, because no matter which way we look at it, the majority, and you saw the numbers that Mary was talking about for India, 10 million people with autism, the vast majority of those as children are going to be educated in the mainstream. That's probably what we're aiming for, in the sense of we want an inclusive environment, but also too in terms of the reality of what services we are. We can't possibly have specialist services across the breadth of India for all children on the autism spectrum, and I don't think that would be desirable. I think it's really important that we do look at history and we look at what's happened and where we've come from, because although we're aware of the fact that we've got a long way to go in terms of providing education for children with autism, when we look back at where we've come from, we have come a long way as well. So thinking about the pre-CADRRE and Asperger days, pre-40s, when autism wasn't formally described as such, we see what happened to children with autism at that time was very variable, and of course depended on the culture that they were growing up in. But we do understand that the outlook for most was pretty grim. These children were obviously not well understood, and we see in folklore in various countries that they were thought to be somehow alien children that were left by the fairies, changelings, not human children. And treatment that was meted out to these children was often horrendous, everything from exorcism. Certainly institutionalisation was common, children were abandoned. We know of feral children who were found living in the woods, children who were highly likely to have been autistic. So we had, at the time autism was first formally described, the prevailing medical framework at the time was very much a psychoanalytic approach to autism, and the idea was predominantly, although Canada did talk about the genetic possibilities with autism, but the idea was predominantly that, as Mary mentioned before, we have parents being blamed for their children's autism, and the idea that children would be treated by psychoanalysis, and parents also would be treated by psychoanalysis to stop them, help them get over being so frigid and emotionally cold and rejecting of their children. As you can imagine, a talking therapy like psychoanalysis had very little effect on children whose comprehension of language is likely to be poor. So again, institutionalisation was very common at this time. We saw in the 50s the emergence of the idea that of learning theory. So the work of Skinner, applied behaviour analysis, and the idea, which we now take for granted, that if you reinforce a behaviour, it's more likely to reoccur, which was actually quite novel at the time. And then we saw these ideas around learning theory applied to autism, particularly by Lovaas in the 60s. And so we saw for the first time the idea that children with autism could learn. And for many parents across the world, this was... Whoa. Sorry for the... Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry about that, especially if you have sound sensitivity. Must have been pretty bad. It was bad up here. Sorry, where was I? The idea that children with autism could learn meant that parents all over the world got together and set up services for children with autism where their children could be taught. So this was a really important advance, and we saw schools for children with autism being set up in Australia in the late 60s, and similarly in the UK and elsewhere in the world. So this was a very important step in the right direction. And then as we progressed, we saw the idea emerging that children with autism should be educated with other children, and that idea that of inclusion, and which was enshrined in the Salamanca Agreement, the UN, in the mid-90s. So the idea that children should be educated together became very important. Okay, so this idea, coupled with changes that occurred at the same time in the mid-90s in the diagnostic criteria for autism, which I think Wen mentioned earlier today, which meant that people with autism but who didn't have an intellectual disability, and I'll try and avoid the term high functioning because, like Wen, I find it not a helpful term, but we saw increasing identification of people at the cognitively able end of the autism spectrum, often referred to as, in DSM-4, referred to as Asperger's syndrome, which has now been dropped in DSM-5, but we have seen, as a result of that inclusion in DSM-4, an increase in numbers of children with autism who do not test out as having an intellectual disability as well. So all of this coincided with that idea that education is a basic human right, so that all children are entitled to an education, and that children should be educated together, so in a mainstream environment, which has had a huge effect and impact on education systems internationally. So we see things like United Nations statements describing autism as more of a difference than a disability. So what statements like this suggest is that we adapt the environment to accommodate people who have those differences that are characteristic of autism. So this too is a really important idea. So thinking about the reality, where are children with autism educated today? What is happening? We have this philosophical commitment in many countries to inclusion in mainstream education, but what does the reality look like? And of course, when we do that, it's actually quite difficult to get accurate, reliable data about where children with autism are actually enrolled in school systems. But what we do see, looking at some of the figures that we have from Australia and also from the US, we do see that we have, in Australia, for example, the school settings that are available for children with autism, we have mainstream, which you see there in the bottom. I've not quite got the colours of the Indian flag there, have I? But the bottom corner, I won't try and get too complicated. Then we've got children who are placed in the mainstream or regular classroom with some support. So they will have, maybe a specialist teacher giving them some support, or an aide allocated to them for some of the time, or maybe even all of the time in the classroom. And then we have also, we've got those regular classes with or without support. Then we see specialist classes for children with disabilities. Now, in Australia, we have quite a number, in some states in particular, of specialist classes for children with autism. So we have autism classes, maybe between 4 and 6 children enrolled in that class with one teacher, and often an aide or a part-time aide allocated to that class as well. So you have specialist classes within mainstream schools, and you also have, of course, special schools. So these are quite separate schools for children with autism, and I believe there are quite a few across India, some 50 I think Mary mentioned. But of course, looking at the population, they would be, they have the capacity to service a very tiny proportion of children with autism who need education. So I'm guessing that in India the situation is children are either at home or they're in mainstream with some degree of support or not. What we also see in figures, where we look at figures from the US, for example, is that students with autism who are enrolled in mainstream schools often don't spend a lot of their time in a regular classroom. So we see that they are actually spending the majority of their time outside of the regular classroom, being withdrawn for specialist services or being withdrawn from the regular class for small group work. So we see quite a complex picture when it comes to what is actually happening in terms of education of children with autism. What sort of outcomes are we getting when we look at our education in relation to autism? Not very good, unfortunately. We do, looking across the research, we see that students with autism in classes participate least actively of all students in the class. So autism results in very low levels of participation in classroom activities, that's academic and non-academic activities. We see that students with autism are more likely to be targeted and bullied. This, unfortunately, is a reality for many students with autism. Occasionally, students with autism will themselves be bullies, but usually they're on the receiving end. We see very high rates of comorbid mental health problems occurring in students with autism in schools. This is particularly the case in high school, where anxiety disorders, depression are very common in the autistic population, suggesting that for many of these students, school is a highly stressful and difficult environment, and the result is high levels of anxiety, which if not treated will then develop into a full-blown anxiety disorder. We see students with autism having very high rates of absenteeism, exclusion, so they're either kept away from school because often anxiety results in school refusal. Students who the parents just can't get them to school. So all sorts of issues that arise resulting in low attendance, often as a result of those anxiety problems. And we have a significant group in Australia who are homeschooled, and I rather suspect it's similar in India. Mary did mention that a lot of children with autism are at home. We also find teachers reporting very high levels of stress associated with autism and the students with autism they have in their schools. So it is not all that cheerful a picture. When we look at academic outcomes, and a review done by my colleague Deb Keane, who's also speaking at the conference here tomorrow morning, into academic outcomes for students with autism in schools, when they looked across the research, again the picture's not very bright. We find that students with autism do underperform academically when you take into consideration their cognitive abilities and levels. So relative to where you would expect them to be performing, given their cognitive ability, they're actually performing quite a lot lower than that, and certainly lower than their typically developing peers. So they're not fulfilling their potential. And this gap widens into high school, which is also very concerning. Even in areas that may have been a relative strength for the student with autism, they can drop behind. And I think it's in relation to the evolution and changes in the curriculum that are happening as they move up through high school, but also to those levels of anxiety and stress, which are going to impact very much on their ability to learn. We know that children who are stressed don't learn. That's a physiological fact. Cortisol affects the ability to learn, so a stressed child is not going to be learning. Looking across the research, predictors of academic outcome include IQ, which is hardly surprising. Behaviour issues come up repeatedly, so high levels of behaviours that challenge, which are often indicative of underlying issues around managing sensory characteristics of autism, managing stress and anxiety. So high levels of behaviour issues are associated with low academic outcomes. Social ability, again, not surprisingly associated with academic achievement. But what does come through very clearly, and I think we had an illustration of that this morning, is that there's a huge amount of variability in the autism population. Now, some people with autism do struggle through school and manage, but they do get through. Some don't have a huge amount of difficulty at school, have more difficulty at tertiary levels, as Bill mentioned. And in fact, we have a number of higher degree research students attached to working with us at the Autism Centre of Excellence who have autism. And of those students, there are several who struggle with severe anxiety problems and mental health, even though they're academically very, very able students. It's still, the stress associated with doing a PhD is pretty high, anyway, as most of you here who've tried it would attest. So, throw some autism characteristics into the mix there, and it's not surprising that the students struggle. So looking at adult outcomes and some research done by Paul Shattuck and his group in the US, we do see poor outcomes in terms, from school in terms of employment. We see continued living at home, so difficulty with moving out and being independent, with young people finishing school, and also social isolation is an issue for people finishing school. So really it's not a brilliant picture. Somebody mentioned earlier today too, it's particularly grim, and I think it was Mary, for families who have low socioeconomic status or other factors which predispose them to those kind of difficulties. So looking at some figures put together by the Living with Autism CRC people, it's a big national research program we have running in Australia, which my university is part of. We can see there, a graphic illustration of the employment levels of people with autism. We think that conservatively 1% of the population in Australia is on the autism spectrum, and of those people as adults, we certainly see the employment levels for people with autism as the lowest of all the disability groups, and certainly less than one would expect in the typical population. So, painted a pretty grim picture, and I do apologise for that in a sense, but we can't escape from the fact that what we have at the moment is not good outcomes for this population. So try to unpack it a bit and trying to look at what the issues are, and then looking at what we can do about it. So I'll move on fairly quickly. I'm keeping an eye on that clock up there. So what the stakeholders are reporting, this is a review that we also did at my centre of the research. There's great focus on the lack of knowledge and understanding of staff, in schools in particular. So understanding of autism, the issues around behaviour that I mentioned before come up particularly from educators in schools as being a major problem. The impact of the social communication characteristics of autism is also high on the list of issues that arise. Bullying and teasing for students with autism, and the relationship with stress and anxiety, and the lack of support and resources in schools. So these are the main themes that come through when we look across the research into stakeholder perspectives. That's educators, other professionals, parents, and students with autism themselves, although we found very little research into the perspectives of students with autism themselves. Some research that does exist, again, that was done as part of the Autism CRC by Beth Saggers and her group in another Queensland university. The issues that students themselves rate as the most difficult, and this is important because these are the sort of areas that we can look at making adjustments and accommodations around. So planning for assignments, working as part of a group. I don't think people would be surprised at any of these, but this is what the students are reporting are particular issues for them. Handwriting comes up repeatedly. Being neat and sorry, that should be another point, coping with bullying or teasing. Coping with change, not surprising. Coping with, again, with being quick enough to keep up with the handwriting. Copying information from the board, also related. Doing homework. Staying calm when other kids annoy me. Staying calm when the classroom's very noisy. This is a quotation from Claire Sainsbury, an English woman with autism, who I think really nails it in terms of, when she says when she was at school she tried hard, she kept trying to obey the rules, to do what she thought was expected of her, but she kept getting it wrong. And she said it was as though everybody was playing a complicated game, but she was the only one who didn't know the rules. It's very reluctant, this pointer. You can move on to the next, thank you. Okay, so what do students rate as the most helpful supports for them? And this is important. Being able to use technology to help with my schoolwork, so an alternative to handwriting. Being able to take a break when it's required, time away from others when I need it, being reminded when a change is going to occur, so being prepared for change, getting a copy of things the teacher writes on the board, doing projects on special interests, that's focusing on projects of passion, I think Wen described them, help to organise myself, receiving rewards for doing things well, and a quiet space to do assessment. So again, sort of adjustments that are very doable and can make a huge amount of difference. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned a few times and has come up also from other speakers this morning, is the importance of not just teaching the person with autism the skills to enable them to cope better with us, with the neurotypical environment, but also how can we adapt the environment to make it autism friendly. And this is particularly important in schools. And this is where we really need to look at a whole school approach. So we need to look at the school environment through the lens of autism to see, what are the things that are going to be particularly difficult for people with autism and how can we modify those to make it easier. So things, for example, things like providing lots of visual supports. So providing, visual schedules, timetables, those sort of things. Providing structure and routine. It was mentioned a couple of times this morning already. Using a keyboard as an alternative to writing. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just a few examples. And again, will depend very much on the individual school and on the individual students in that school. There we go. There's a lovely book by Luke Jackson called Freaks, Geeks and Asperger's. And he's a young man now, but he wrote this as a teenager, and he talks about the importance of adapting, so that he describes himself as a square peg, so a peg with sort of angles, trying to fit itself into a circle with sticky out bits. So it's finding that fit. How can we make square pegs fit into round holes? By adapting, each coming part of the way to enable that to happen. I mentioned individual variability before and how important that is. There's a quote there from Stephen Shaw who said, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So we do need to look at an individualised approach. So we need to, undertake a process which involves assessment of the person with autism. The process needs to be collaborative and multidisciplinary. Autism is a multidisciplinary condition. So it's really important that we involve people from a whole range of professional areas. We need to focus on both the academic curriculum and the hidden curriculum. Sorry. We need to be very systematic, set goals. We need to evaluate and review those goals regularly. So we need that individualised approach. So when it comes to assessment, we also need to think about the whole school, and this is some work that we did in Far North Queensland with schools who were mainstream schools who had a lot of students with autism enrolled, who were interested in improving their capacity to provide for these students with autism. And these are the areas that the whole school's nominated as needing attention. Professional development for staff, which came up before. Providing the right sort of conditions for learning, so that's managing the environment. Shared leadership, so it was very important that the school leadership was on board with the project. It's no point in sending off a teacher's aide for some training and expecting them to come back and sort the problems. It's got to be a whole school initiative, and for the whole school to be involved and engaged, it takes leadership. So it's really important, we found, with the work that we were doing with these schools, to get the principal on board and get the principal actively involved. So we need to look at both the curriculum content and the teaching process across the whole school, and also inclusion of parents and the whole school community. So the sort of outcomes that we got with this project, now this project ran for 18 months across 3 schools, so 1 primary, 1 high school and 1 K-12, which goes right through from Little East to high school. And what we found was that the schools reported back increased awareness in the whole school community of the needs of students with autism, increased knowledge about evidence-based practice, because we really focused on that with PD for the schools. So evidence-based practice for students with autism, what we know works. and what we can do. And establishing that whole school process and systems, particularly around positive behaviour support, which will be benefited all of the students in the school, not just the students with autism. So these were the whole school strategies that were adopted. Moving on and looking at class and group outcomes, this is like small group strategies that were adopted that were successful. We found alternative break programs and targeted literacy groups, for example. So specifically targeted small group work was helpful in a sort of middle tier there. And I'm running out of time and the clicker's still not doing its thing. Tier 1 was individual outcomes for students, so that was the students with autism in particular that we were focusing on, and we found that for those students we saw a reduction in behaviour issues, an increase in academic engagement and performance, which was variable across the schools. Only one school did a really detailed program. So most importantly, what we found was that the schools as a whole reported that the project enabled them to examine the sorts of support they could provide for students with autism, and share that culture. And there's the buzzer. So I'm just going to finish with the last slide. The last slide there, which just from Ban Ki-moon and the United Nations, saying that how important it is to recognise the talents of persons on the autism spectrum rather than focusing on their weaknesses, and that this is essential for creating a society that's truly inclusive. Thank you.